as always, I appreciate Mr. Overstreet being here. Mr. Overstreet is the extension agent up in Lamar County, and he's going to share with us his wisdom and experience about starting out as a beekeeper. I am a absolute novice as a beekeeper, so I will be listening and seeing if hopefully I can pick up a few tricks along the way as well. But with that, thank you again, Ross, for being here, and take it away.
No problem. I appreciate it as always, Dr. Stevenson. It's always a pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure to get the invite to join in on one of your presentations here, and usually have a pretty good little crowd here, so always enjoy it, and it's always good to see some familiar names and faces like I do today as well. So that being said, we will go ahead and be getting started. As Christian said, my name is Ross Overstreet, and I am the extension agent here in Lamar County. Our office is in Purvis, and as Christian said, we're always here to answer any questions any of you have, and if we can't answer it, we can definitely point you in the right direction or find the answer for you if so be. So today I do want to talk to you a little bit about beginner beekeeping. Today I'm just going to kind of basically go over the equipment that you're going to need, and I'll probably do kind of like I did in my series on the home lawn management. I'll probably do a little series on this as far as bee biology and bee equipment, and maybe some seasonal management and just some different aspects of beekeeping that you need to be aware of and think about before you just dive right off into it, because there is a little bit more to beekeeping these days than there used to be. It used to be pretty easy, pretty low key, pretty low maintenance, and pretty carefree for the most part. But nowadays, with a few new pests we have and some new issues that have come up, we do see a little bit more issues with some issues as far as diseases and mites and some issues we have in the beehive. So I'm by no means an expert at this. I have kind of like Christian said, as he was a kind of a novice, I'm just a more experienced novice for the most part. A few more years under my belt, but still a long way to go. A lot to learn. I'm by no means a commercial guy or not even a sideliner. I'm definitely a hobbyist beekeeper. I've had up to like 6 hives is about the most I've ever had. So, and I don't have that now. So if that tells you anything about my management of bees, that's, I'll let you run with that if you'd like. But I will go ahead and get started with my presentation. Again, it shows disabled screen sharing, Christian. But it's just a basic little, there we go. Basic little presentation on basically the equipment that you're going to want to look into to start your hive. I would recommend that most everybody, if you're interested in this, to most counties or most little areas, regions throughout the state have beekeeping clubs or beekeeper meetings that usually meet once a month or once a quarter or something like that. I would like to invite you to get involved with your local beekeeping association. There's a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge in those seasoned beekeepers, whether it be commercial guys or sideliners, which are kind of the in-between between hobbyists and the commercial people that don't do it really full time, but also are a little more involved than just the backyard beekeeper. So do contact your local county office, and they usually have a list of local clubs, or you can contact the Mississippi Beekeepers Association. Go to their website. There is a list of associations throughout the state that list their meeting dates and locations. We do have one here that meets at Purvis, or has been meeting here in Purvis up until the past couple months when all the COVID-19 and coronavirus stuff started. We meet the first Thursday of each month at 7 p.m. here in Purvis. Meetings usually last about an hour, and we cover a different topic depending on what's going on that time of year. So it's usually try to schedule a speaker and a presentation on something that's relevant or will be relevant within the next few weeks of the meeting. So would recommend each of you do that if you are interested. A lot of these guys are very willing to let you come out to their apiaries or their bee, help them work their bees, let you learn from doing it instead of trying it on your own, investing a lot of money, and because it's not cheap, and then you realize it's not for you. So that's a good way to get involved and kind of learn what's going on and what you need to be doing and that kind of stuff. So I would recommend that you do that. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you get a beehive or think about getting a beehive is get basically a bee suit of some sort. Now, you don't have to have the full bee suit like top left corner there. That's up to you, personal preference. In South Mississippi, those things can get hot during the summertime when you're basically out there working bees. So they don't breathe all that well, and they can get rather stuffy. But you will more than likely need some type of safety apparel. Me personally, I just use the jacket and some blue jeans like on the bottom left there with the veil and some gloves. I know some guys that just use the veil and the helmet kind of on the top right. And some people don't go without gloves. It just depends on your preference, what works for you, how comfortable you are with your bees or working with bees, and kind of your safety threshold. Or me, I'm just a little bit allergic to bees. I'm not deathly allergic to them, but if I do get stung by them, I swell up pretty good and get all red, and it can be a little scary. So I definitely take as much precaution as I can and try to wear, at least a jacket and a veil and some gloves and blue jeans and some boots. So try to keep them from crawling up my pants legs, stuff like that. But that's going to be the first thing you want to invest in once you're thinking about getting some bees. Obviously, you need to get this kind of stuff before you get your bees. So shop around. There are some local places that are starting to carry a lot more of this equipment than there used to be. It used to be you just basically had to get on mail order or online and order these kind of things. But a lot of our farm and garden stores have noticed that there has been a renewed interest in this from backyard hobbyist beekeepers, and they're starting to carry some of this equipment. So just something you need to think about. A smoker, a lot of great things to come from a good smoker. A smoke is used to basically calm the bees down when you're starting to work on them. When you're opening up that hive, you want to introduce a little bit of smoke into the hive. You don't want to go too crazy with it, and you don't want a hot smoke. Typically, a lot of people, you can buy little pellets or like pieces of wool or cotton that you can push down into the smoker. Around here, there's not a shortage of dried pine straw, which is basically what I use and most people use because it's readily abundant and it's free for the most part. Now, don't go out trespassing on other people's land stealing pine straw, but you can purchase this as well in the bales, and one bale will last you a very, very long time. But basically, the smoke kind of acts as a calming agent for the bees. There's a little bit of not confusion, but a little bit of questions as to how it works. But for the most part, I believe the consensus is that it works by kind of tricking the bees into thinking there's maybe a fire nearby or coming. And so the bees go in the hive, they gorge themselves on the honey to get ready just in case that they have to leave the hive, and they can stuff their honey stomachs full of honey in case they have to fly. And then they can try to keep that amount of honey and have it ready to deposit into a new hive if necessary. And once they get full, they just kind of want to lay there and hang out. They're not too interested in stinging you, and they just kind of chills them out. So Now, obviously, as we all know, hopefully that bees would prefer not to sting you. That's their last line of defense, because unlike a wasp or yellow jacket or something, they have a barbed stinger. So when they sting you, the barb comes out as long as some of their entrails. So it does kill them. So they prefer not to sting you. So just be gentle. This kind of calms them down, and you don't want to, you don't want to go knocking on the hives and being real rough with them. And as long as you make slow movements and aren't swatting at them and that sort of stuff, you typically won't have an issue. So a smoker, and a good smoker, is pretty valuable. It'll last you quite a few years. You can buy the cheaper kind that just kind of have the little plastic bellow on the back. The bellow will kind of, the more you use it, that it'll draw holes into it and it'll lose its capability. You can purchase replacement bellows for these things, but a lot of times it's just as cheap to just to replace the whole smoker as it is to replace just the bellow. But I would encourage you to go ahead and invest in a good smoker to last you multiple years. Just like most all of this equipment, your bee suit, your smoker, your hive tools, all of your frames and your boxes and that type of stuff should last you multiple years. But beekeeping can be quite an investment financially and economically. So just know that kind of going into it. But again, if you kind of split that cost over the amount of time that most of all this stuff lasts, it's not that much, but it is a kind of a big initial investment. So once you got your smoker and your, I thought I had something on here about a hive tool. But you will need a hive tool, and there are a couple of options, and I could have swore I put that frame in here or that slide in here, but I apologize for that oversight there. But a hive tool, there are a couple of different options. Any of those really work well. I like the J-hook kind just because it basically gives you the ability to kind of pry out the frames from within the boxes pretty easily, because sometimes the frames can become kind of glued in there, and with the propolis and the wax and the comb being overlapping through the frames and from the frames to the bodies and that and the boxes. So the J-hook makes it a little bit easier and a little more convenient. So so then you're going to want to look at in actual bee boxes or hive bodies. There are a couple of different options. Most people use the Langstroth hive, which is what you're seeing here. This is another view of it. This is a typical Langstroth hive, how it's set up. You'll have the hive stand starting at the bottom. Then you will have the base board or the entrance board on the next level up from the bottom. And then you see the hive body, which is the tall box that has, you can either buy 8 or 10 frame equipment. And within that hive body, you see those frames, which are hanging vertically and parallel to each other within the hive body. So upon these frames is where you will have a foundation, whether it be wax or plastic, and that's what the bees will actually draw their comb on, and that's where within those cells on the comb where the queen will lay her eggs. The workers will deposit the pollen and the nectar and the honey. So that's the business end of the hive, or those frames and the foundation upon them. So going up from the big large box at the bottom up, you'll see what's called a queen excluder. Is basically a wire mesh that keeps the queen from advancing up into the upper boxes and laying eggs. We basically want her to stay in the bottom box or 2. Sometimes you can have 2 of these what's called hive bodies, which are the deep boxes, and then up above those narrow ones are what's called honey supers. Those are where the excess honey will be deposited, and that's where we will eventually, hopefully, gather our honey from. You'll see those are a little bit narrower, a little bit shallower boxes than the hive body at the bottom. And that's typically because once those things are filled with honey, they can be extremely heavy. So just for ease of your back, just to make it easier on you and your body, lifting those things, carrying them around, getting them off the hive and taking them to your truck or four-wheeler, however it is you're transporting them, just to cut the weight down. That makes it easier to use either narrower or shallower frame. So going back a slide, you can see down at the bottom, starting at the bottom board, going up, you see the deep hive body is 9 5/8 inch tall and 16 1/4 inch wide. And then you go up, you can get a medium, which is 6 5/8. So it's 3 inches shallower, or you can get a super shallow, which is 5 11/16. So about another inch or so narrower than even the medium. And that basically, this is all personal preference, whichever, there's really no rhyme or reason as to one working better than the other. It's all personal preference and just what works best for you and your ability or your physical strength to pick one of those up. One of those deep hive bodies full of pure honey probably weigh 80, 90 pounds. So that can wear out on you pretty quick, depending on how many of them you have to mess with each day. A lot of these commercial guys that have up to 10,000 hives, if they're going out there doing 10,000, taking off 10,000 of those, each one of them weighs 100 pounds, they'll definitely be sore by the end of the day. So just something to think about there as well. So the top shallow box or honey super you see at the top with the brown at the top, the brown rounds, those are what's called Ross rounds. Just like my name, Ross, but it's basically a way to produce comb honey. So that's where in the jar or in the little plastic clam shells, you can buy clam shells that are round just like that, the shape, and you basically, the bees build a comb and deposit honey into those rounds. You take the whole comb and sealed with the honey in it and put it in that little plastic clam shell. And then that's where you get your comb honey from. So instead of just buying a jar of honey, you can actually sell it, get a little more price premium for it. Or, I use a lot of my stuff for just gifts to family and friends. And a lot of people just enjoy the kind of the, or just enjoy having something different other than just a jar of honey. It's just kind of a little conversations piece, and just kind of neat just to have the actual honey so you can know it's, it is pure honey. And then up above the Ross round box, you will see an inner cover, and that's basically just a top cover that has a hole drilled in it. Right there, you see the hole 1 1/4 by 3 1/2, and that's just lets air flow in and out. Kind of acts like the chimney of the hive, so they can kind of regulate the airflow. So it's drawing air in the bottom and allowing that heat and to escape to where the bees don't overheat. Bees are very good at generating heat. A lot of times you may see hives that have a big beard of bees hanging off the outside, and they're either too hot or too cold, and they're using their wings and generating heat or generating airflow to move air throughout that hive, to keep fresh air in there and to get it to a comfortable temperature for them. And then at the top, you will see an outer cover, which is basically just the lid. This is just something that basically just keeps the water out of it. A lot of times it will be covered with like a sheet metal or some type of little more weatherproof covering. There are a couple of different options for the outer cover. There's basically a migratory cover. There's the kind I'm talking about with the sheet metal, or a lot of people just use pieces of plywood or something like that. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but obviously the ones with the metal stapled down over the lid will last a little bit longer. But again, that's just when you got quite a few hives, the quicker you can open them up and get in and out of them, the quicker your overall operation is going to be. So you're not spending a bunch of time basically trying to get in and out of the hives while you're working on them. So like I said, there's a lot of flexibility within beekeeping. Again, this is the most common Langstroth hive. There are the top bar hives, which is basically this, but laid down on its side, and you build from front to back for the most part. Instead of building up, you're building long ways or deep front to back. So again, not a lot of people use that commercially or for hobbyists. A lot of hobbyists do use it. It's not as common here as it is kind of in the north and northeast, in the Midwest. Those are a few more places where it's a little more common, but you just don't see very much of it. And there are other options as well. We're not going to delve too far into those. I've been seeing a lot on Facebook and some other things about flow hives, and I know those were a big hit a couple of years ago. Were new, where you just basically turn the tap and on the back of the hive and honey starts running out into you, filling your jars. So again, that's kind of more of a basically a conversation piece, or a kind of just it's not really meant for commercial use, or for basically for widespread use. It's just kind of something that you use just to say you have it. And if you look down at the bottom right there on that bottom board, you'll see that little piece of wood that is kind of laying across there, and that's basically just what's called an entrance reducer. And those basically you can rotate or leave in or out, and that basically, depending on the weather and the size of your hive and some conditions, that just allows you to regulate how wide of an opening there is on that bottom board to allow bees in and out. So if the weather's cold, obviously you don't want a whole bunch of cold air getting pushed into that hive. So an entrance reducer works great in those instances during the winter. And also when you have a new hive or a weakened hive, and with not a lot of large numbers, that can make it easier for the bees to guard that entrance from predators or from other bees that may be coming in to rob that hive of their supplies, whether it be pollen or honey or nectar or something like that. So that's what you're seeing down there at the bottom. So hopefully that's about as clear as mud. But speaking of, when I said the frames, this is what I'm talking about, the foundation. The one on the left that is yellow, that is basically a standard format for a wax foundation. The frame is the wooden part around the outside that holds the foundation. Again, you can get wax coated plastic foundation that lasts many years. And this is something that you will definitely want to use. Because redoing this each year and the bad thing about making comb honey is you destroy your comb. So the bees have to make that wax every year or each time you destroy it. So if you're pulling out those foundation or those frames that have wax and you're using it for comb honey, those bees have to consume wax to make honey. So you're going to have a smaller honey crop. The more wax they have to produce, the less honey they're going to be able to produce. So you want to be able to reuse as much product or as much equipment that you have available to you. So now there's nothing wrong with making some comb honey, but me, in my sense, for me, I just as well just have the honey, and I'd rather be able to reuse my equipment, because once they draw out the foundation, the one on the right is a plastic foundation, the grayish looking one, and it's just basically they've taken a paint roller and spread melted wax over that plastic foundation that has the imprint of the comb or the cells on them, and they will draw that out to the preferred thickness or depth of the cell. And then each year you can reuse, or each honey flow, you can reuse those same foundation to where the bees don't have to remake that wax every year. So that just increases your honey production and the amount of honey that you're able to pull off of that hive each year. And when I say honey flow, that's the 2 times of year that basically in our neck of the woods that bees are producing honey. And I think we had one that basically just finished. Typically honey flows are in the spring, and in late summer, early fall, when in the spring when spring flowers are blooming, and then again in late summer, early fall when you got your fall, your goldenrods, your maybe some black-eyed Susans, some other things that are blooming. But right now we're basically just getting to the end of our spring honey flow. That was basically our tallow, our privet hedge, our spring wildflowers, that sort of stuff is what our South Mississippi honey is at this time of year. So those are very good honey producers. They're very heavy in nectar, and you can produce quite a bit of honey off of out of those. So typically the spring honey is your lighter colored and lighter tasting honey. And then in the fall, you'll have your goldenrod. Those will typically be your stronger honeys, darker colored, richer, more pungent tasting. It's not bad. It's just got a little bit different taste to it than your spring lighter honey. So clover honey is a lot of people call your spring honey. So because basically that's another flower that's blooming, but during the spring. But that's just something to think about. This option of, I do make a couple of frames of wax or comb honey each year, but I don't really do an entire hive out of it, just because I want to try to reuse that same equipment and not have the bees have to remake those frames and draw out those frames and foundation each year. I can basically uncap them whenever I'm extracting it, and I can let them sit outside, let the bees harvest and dry them off and get all the remnants of the honey off of it, and let them reuse that back in the hive. And then I can store these frames that are already drawn out, and when the next honey flow starts, I can just throw them back on there, and the bees can start depositing honey straight into them without having to redraw that comb and use honey in the process. So as I mentioned to you earlier, the hive body which is the 2 boxes you see on the bottom, those 2 large, deeper boxes. The blue area is where the brood typically is found, within the center of those frames. Again, you can buy 10 frame or 8 frame equipment, just depending on how, your preference. 8 frame equipment's obviously going to be a little bit lighter when it's full of honey than a 10 frame. It's just got 2 less frames in it, so lighter weight, and a little bit cheaper, just because typically you don't have to buy as much equipment for it. But the blue area again is where the queen typically lays all of her eggs and raises the brood, and then along the outside of the boxes is where they store their honey and their pollen and or nectar. So typically the queen stays within that blue area. That's kind of her area where she lays the eggs and the brood hatches. So the brood is what you see over on the bottom right, the brown sealed little brood chambers, cells. That's where the eggs have been. Those are capped brood. So those are pretty close to being to coming out as fresh baby bees, if you want to say. They go from an egg to a bee. So once they're an egg, they lay in the bottom of the cell as an egg, and then the bees, once they get enough food in there for the bees to develop, they will seal it off, and then at that point, the baby bee will chew its way out whenever it's ready to emerge. So you see on the bottom over on the left, the H's, that's where your honey is. And basically what we extract or what we harvest from or from the hives will be those top 2 boxes. We won't try to harvest the stuff down at the bottom because this is their food. This is what they use to survive over the winter. So if we take all of their food, we're either going to have to feed them supplemental sugar water or something like that. So it's best just to, obviously just their honey is more nutritious than sugar water. So we prefer to leave them enough honey throughout the winter for them to survive on without having to supplemental feed them too much. There are times you may still have to supplemental feed, but for the most part, we try to leave enough of their own honey for their reserves for the winter time. So kind of getting into basic biology of the bees, the queen, there is only one queen per hive. And they're not born with that pink spot on their back. I wish it was that easy, but a lot of times beekeepers will go in and mark their queen just to make it a lot easier to identify them, or they'll use a different color depending on what year that queen was hatched and raised, and then that way they can know, all right, well, this queen's 2 years old, this queen's 1 year old, that sort of stuff. So they may use a pink color this year, a blue color next year, or 2020 pink, 2019 blue, and then they'll know if they go in and see a blue dot on one, they know that queen's been in there since 2019. But again, it does just make it a lot easier to see her or to find her within the hive whenever you're opening it up, just checking your hive. And that's something you will want to do pretty often. It's not something you have to do every day. I know a lot of beginner beekeepers, and I know I was guilty of it too. Once you get them, you're just kind of enthralled with them, and you just want to kind of go out there every day and just check on them and look at them and watch them. And that's very understandable. They are pretty interesting little insects, and they're kind of fun to watch. Sometimes on a nice day, when it ain't 100 degrees outside, it's not bad to go out. I enjoy going and just sitting on the tailgate of the truck, watching them fly in and out of the hive. You can see kind of where they're going, what they're coming back with, if they got pollen in their on their legs, in their storage sacks. They're just interesting creatures to watch. They have a very, very interesting biology, and they just very, very interesting. So there is only one queen. She lays all of the eggs within the hive. She can lay up to 2,000 eggs per day. So she can be quite busy during certain times of year, and we're just finishing up one of like I said, the honey flow is typically their busy time. So that's when she's busy laying eggs, is leading up to and during the honey flow, because she wants the biggest workforce she can possibly have out there gathering food and supplies for the hive. So they do all work as one unit. They're all in this together. So they want the largest numbers possible for the good of everyone. So the queen is basically the egg layer. She's the one that lays all the eggs, and then all of your worker bees are female bees. They're not necessarily sterile, but they don't lay eggs. You can have a laying worker at times when the queen's hurt or something like that, but typically the queen's the only one that lays eggs. She's the only one you want laying eggs. And you can see by her appearance, she is rather a little bit larger than your normal worker bees. She's a little bit longer, a little bit more wasp looking like. So walks a little funny sometimes along the hive, so she can be kind of easy to spot, but a lot of times she likes to try to hide out and go away from wherever you're looking. She'll go on the other side of the hive, or not on the other side of the hive, but on the other side of the frame that you pull out, and as you're rotating that frame, she's just kind of dancing back and forth. So it can make it a lot easier to mark them. And a lot of times when you purchase hives or purchase nucleus or package bees, they will already come marked for you. And then you have the male bees, which are called drones. They are kind of more bumblebee looking like. They're a little bit fatter, bigger eyes, bigger head. And they're basically, their only job within the hive is to mate with the queen. So they're not out there harvesting pollen or nectar or making honey or anything like that. So you see drones come along typically in the springtime when queens are being hatched, and they'll fly off, mate with queens, and then typically they either die, or typically in the fall the hive will kick the drone bees out of the hive and say, hey, you're not sitting in here all winter and not contributing, yet going to eat all of our honey over the winter. So they'll usually kick the male bees out. But yeah, the female or the worker bees, they're the ones that do all the work. They clean the hive, they produce the honey, they go out and collect the nectar and the pollen. They're the ones that do all of the work, and they're 99.5% of the hive. The queen is one. There's one queen, and then the rest are the other 1% basically is drones. So, and typically drones only live for just a few weeks. So queens, they can vary in production. So a lot of times, a lot of people replace their queens yearly, sometimes every 2 years, depending on her strength and how she's doing. That's one thing about going in and, you know, checking your hives is you can check the status of her, make sure she's laying enough eggs as to what's going on at that time of year. Obviously, if it's in the dead of summertime and there's absolutely nothing blooming, you know, she shouldn't be in there just laying a whole bunch of eggs. So it's okay at that time of year and in the winter for her to not to be too busy, and her to just be kind of hanging out, because they don't need a whole bunch of numbers at that time eating their honey and not being able to produce honey. So just something to think about. Where, now that you've kind of thought about getting a hive, you kind of need to think about where you want to, or where you're going to put it. Basically, you want to shelter it from the wind. So you want some type of wind break. So whether it be a line of hedge bushes or a line of trees, or, you know, a fence row or something like that is usually a good option. Typically, you want them to be facing south or not north, to where a north wind is blowing, cold north wind is blowing straight into the entrance of the hive. And you basically want to make sure they are not in a low spot, because obviously if on that one on the left, the bees can't get in the hive because the entrance is underwater. So you want to get it up on a stand or on some cinder blocks, something like that. It is a good idea to strap them down, especially, you know, during hurricane season, you know, during severe weather, during our times when, you know, February, March, April, when we can have some tornadoes and some high winds or fronts coming through. Last thing you want to do is have all that out there and then come out the next day and just see scattered boxes everywhere after you've done all that work. So again, make sure you're protecting them from the wind. You kind of want the entrance to be facing as much to the east as possible, and the hive to catch as much of that morning east sun as possible. Just like plants, you want that hive to kind of wake up early, first thing in the morning, warm up on a cool day, or them to wake up on a, you know, when the spring and in the fall when the honey's going, and you want them out there working. So the afternoon or evening sun is fine. You want them a little bit shaded. You don't want it to be 115 degrees because you can cook some bees also. So great thing about it is they're pretty, for the most part, they're pretty self-regulating, but you want to give them the best chance possible. So if you are in a neighborhood and you have, you know, your neighbors, you're concerned whether or not neighbors are going to be affected by your beehive. Typically, if you can put your entrance to the hive facing a fence or a hedgerow and force those bees to come out of the hive and go up into the air above head level, that's where they're going to stay until they can find a nectar source or a pollen source. like a flower or bush or something. So technically, you know, if they just can come straight out of the hive and go straight across, yeah, you may have some issues with your neighbor. But if you can force those bees to go up and get above head level, they're typically not going to be much of a bothersome to your neighbors. Obviously, you don't want them to put them up next to beside a road to where, as they're coming out of that hive, they're getting squished on the front of a car or a windshield. So don't, you know, try to avoid that if at all possible. I have seen instances of that being called out and somebody saying, my bees are just disappearing on me. I don't know where it is. And I go out and they got them out in the front yard basically. And as the bees are coming out there's a high traffic area. And I said, well, all your bees are on the front of a car or somewhere. So just something to avoid, pretty common sense, but just something else to think about. Again, you want them a little bit shaded, receive morning sun. Again, the shade, it's not necessary for them. They can regulate that temperature. That's mostly for your convenience. So depending on when you're going to plan on working the bees, and obviously during the day when the majority of the bees are out of the hive out working is when you want to be in there working. You don't want a full nest whenever you come knocking at the door. You want a lot of your workers out there, and that way it's less bees for you to have to worry about injuring when you're in there working them or checking on them. Just some things like that. So you do want a water source close by. So if your neighbor's got a pool, you may want to, when you start your hive, you may want to think about creating your own water source to where closer to the hive, because once they kind of get their mind and set on a water source, that's the one they're going to use. So you'll be getting some calls from your neighbor saying, man, your bees, and there will be a bunch of them. They will make a raft of bees, and your neighbors won't be very happy with you, and they are attracted to salt water. So saltwater pools are some of their favorites. So you do want to provide them with a water source. A lot of times I know people will install or not install, but just leave a faucet kind of dripping and lay like a little piece of 2x4 underneath that drip. And the bees will come in, land on that little 2x4. The 2x4 will stay moist, and then that's where they'll come in and get their drink of water from. So obviously a stock tank or something like that works just as well, bird bath, but you do want to provide them a good clean water source. You also need to make sure you got enough food around. This typically isn't an issue. There's usually enough gardens and flowers, wildflowers and pastures and things like that around to where, where it's not an issue. But, you get in South Mississippi, we can get into these wide expanses of a pretty pure pine tree forest. So obviously pine trees don't offer much nutrition for them. So you want to make sure you provide them with some other things as well. And these are some good options. If you have some of these things around, you should be all right. Obviously, we don't have too many cotton and soybeans growing around. We do have plenty of Chinese tallow. Obviously, not much sourwood or tupelo or mesquite for that matter. But these are some things up kind of more central North Mississippi over in the Delta that you can kind of see. So when do you want to start your hive? Typically, the better, but not when April, May. You'd like to have them before probably April or May, sometime around March, end of March, beginning of April, because that's when our hive, or that's when our honey flow is about to start. So if you can have a small hive or a small nucleus hive, then typically they will grow fast because there's plenty of food for them around. So if you were out there trying to start a hive right now, it'd be kind of difficult because there's really not a lot of food out there for them to grow. And so they may just sit there for a little while, and you have to baby them through the summertime until the fall. But obviously, you know, it's going to kind of depend on what's available to you around you, what beekeepers are, or when they're available from beekeepers, or, you know, you can order packaged sets of bees as well. So this is what I was telling you, how our, you kind of want them at maybe beginning of March, end of March, and then you can grow your hives quickly. You'll see kind of coming out of winter, during winter, their numbers reduce greatly within the hive. That spring, which is definitely our largest flow, honey flow, you'll see their numbers greatly increase, almost double or more. So you can see a big increase in production and numbers of bees in that spring flow. Then we kind of get into the dearth of summer, when everything's so hot and dry and nothing's really blooming or growing. So they'll see a little bit of downturn, and then their numbers will kind of go back up in the early summer, late fall, or late summer, early fall. And then going into winter, their numbers will kind of decline again as well. So it's just all based off of food. Their numbers and the colony population is based off the food source. And speaking of food, just like I was saying, pine trees, coniferous forest, not very much use for us. So grasses also not very good. So as long as if you've got some meadows out there that's got wildflowers, or, you know, not pastures or not hay crops, you're probably all right. So obviously urban areas are usually pretty good. There's a high diversity of crops, whether it be wildflowers or landscape plants, that kind of stuff. And obviously power lines, that kind of things aren't managed very well. So there are a lot of wildflowers and weeds and things, that flowering weeds, that are available to them. And then once you kind of got your bees, you're going to want to look at harvesting your honey. So there is some equipment required to harvest the honey for the most part. Obviously you can see you're going to have something to decap the frames and the foundation. Over here on the left, you can see how they're using that hot knife to cut that wax covering off of to expose the honey within the cells. There's a lot of different options available for uncapping tools. You can just basically use a fork, or it's like a pick, or a little roller with spikes on it that rolls across, punching holes in all the little wax cappings. Or you can use heated knives, wax cutting knives, those sorts of things. And then you'll need basically an extractor, which is basically uses centrifugal force to spin the honey out of the cells. And then you'll need some type of bucket or something to where you can store the honey, and whether it be put it in jars or leave it in the bucket and just harvest it straight out of the bucket. So once you harvest it, obviously you're going to want to filter it some way. So you can buy filters, different mesh sizes of filters to filter the honey, the bee parts, or you know, the legs and all the little bee parts, or wax and just trash and stuff that you have in the honey. You're going to want to filter that out to where your honey is nice and clean and clear and pure. So those are available. Again, you know, a lot of times beekeeping associations have these tools available for checkout, or if you know a beekeeper, they're willing to let you borrow it, or, you know, you can bring yours when they're extracting, kind of get together in a group. So you can kind of save on some cost on some of these things. You can kind of share some of this stuff. But a lot of times, you know, depending on your size, you may want to purchase your own, or just for convenience sake, or whatever it may be. And again, you're going to want to filter or strain out your wax coatings. And yeah, it's nice to have a water jacketed bottling tank to keep your honey from basically crystallizing and turning into a big solid mass of honey or sugar. But there's nothing wrong with that honey. A lot of y'all probably have had issues or had times in the past where you bought a jar of honey, it sat in the cabinet for a while, and then it turned into crystallized sugar. It's still honey. It's still good, nothing wrong with it. As long as the moisture content is correct, honey is one of the few foods that really never goes bad. So basically what you want to do in that instance is warm the honey slowly and gently. Whether boil some water, take the water off of the eye to where it's then just cooling off. Set your jar into that warm water and let it just sit there and let it melt that sugar or melt those crystals back down into honey. You won't taste any, it won't have any, it'll taste just like the regular honey it did before it crystallized. But you know, you don't get it too hot. You don't want to scorch it. You don't want to cook it. So don't put it in the microwave. Don't put it in boiling water. You know, you could use tap water, boiling tap water. Or a lot of times what I do, I just, in the summertime, if I have some, I'll set it in the dashboard of my truck with the windows rolled up and leave it in there for an hour or so. And it'll get up to plenty warm enough to melt that honey back down. So that's basically all I've got for you today. I know I kind of drug it out a little bit longer than usual, but there is a little bit to go into as far as equipment. Again, I will be kind of expanding on some of these options and some of this other stuff a little in further presentation. So like I said, I know I kind of skipped around a little bit, but I'll delve off into the bee biology with the queen and the drones and the workers and some of the food sources on different presentations, that sort of stuff. So just bear with us, and hopefully you got a little bit of an idea. Maybe, like I said, now is the time to start planning for next year's bees. Now it's not the best time to be getting bees. Just because we're about at the end of our food source for the spring, but now's the time to kind of start gathering up your supplies and looking forward to getting on the list of maybe a local beekeeper that'll have some hives available or a nucleus hive available for sale next late winter, early spring. So any questions with that being said?